As we begin our look at the James Bond novels, I quickly want to make it clear how this will be different from my other review series. These are books, some of which are pretty different to their film counterparts, and while all the Fleming works have been adapted into comic form a few times, few of the subsequent books have gotten that treatment. So in the interest of consistency amongst the videos, and because I refuse to sit in front of a camera and record myself, I've decided to axe the visual component for the most part. There may still be some visual asides that I'll put up from time to time, but you can treat this more as an audio-only thing. This hopefully will speed up how quickly these reviews take to make, and I'm hoping this will be one of the more frequent regular uploads to the channel. I hope you'll get as much or more enjoyment out of these as my usual offerings. I have a recurring nightmare. I'll be in the back seat of a car. No one else is with me. The car will be barreling down the road, sometimes with surrounding traffic and sometimes with nothing else in sight. I'll struggle to get to the front seat before the car inevitably crashes, but I'll never succeed. The scariest part of that dream to me isn't the speed of the car or how far it is to get from the back seat to the front. It's the loss of control. It's the nagging feeling that if I just had a hand on the wheel or a foot on the pedal, I could prevent this accident. Feeling lost in a world that's moving forward with or without you is something I feel is a pretty universally shared fear. I don't need to be master of the world at large, nor do I want to prevent change from occurring at all. I just want to have some input on my own world. So what does this have to do with Casino Royale, the first of the James Bond novels? Well, we'll get to that. Ian Fleming was at an important pivot point in his life when James Bond came to be. He had had an affair with Anne Charteris beginning in 1939, which lasted through 2 of her marriages. After she divorced her second husband, she got engaged to Ian. In anticipation of the wedding, Fleming began to write Casino Royale on February 17, 1952, based in part off of some of his experiences during World War II. He finished the manuscript rather quickly in March. He had previously mentioned to his friends that he wanted to write a spy novel, and he had some help in getting it published thanks to a contact at Jonathan Cape and due to his brother Peter being an established author. Casino Royale was published in 1953 to good reviews and strong enough sales that Cape offered him a 3-book contract. The first paperback editions came in 1955, with the US version being retitled. It was noticed almost immediately by film and television producers upon its release. A 1954 TV adaptation for the show Climax was made, and Gregory Radoff purchased the film rights in 1955, beginning a long odyssey of its own that kept the story out of the hands of Cubby and Harry when they started making the official films in 1962. The story would be adapted again into a spoof in 1967 by Charles K. Feldman, and the rights would be entangled in a legal battle in the 1990s, resulting in Eon Productions finally securing those rights and leading to the first proper hard reboot of the series in 2006 with Daniel Craig's first entry. The story is fairly simple as far as these books go. Head of S, the department within the Secret Service assigned over the Soviets, proposes an operation to bring down Le Chiffre, or Le Chiffre. Le Chiffre purchased control of a chain of brothels using state funds from Leningrad, and a new law enacted by the French resulted in him losing most of his money. To recoup this, Le Chiffre plans to gamble at Casino Royale. If he loses, it will humiliate both him and the Soviets and likely lead to his death. Head of S suggests sending the best gambler in the service to defeat Le Chiffre at the tables, and M selects James Bond 007. Bond travels to Royale to meet up with 3 allies: his old friend Mathis, a CIA operative named Felix Leiter, and the secretary of Head of S, Vesper Lind. Bond is none too keen about having a woman in the group, but he changes his tune pretty quickly after meeting her and being excited by her beauty and personality. After an attempt on his life, the night of the game finally comes, with Bond having to rely on both luck and skill to beat Le Chiffre. Little does he know the danger this night has in store for him, and that he will never be the same again. When I got into James Bond in the summer of 2004, my first book was The Man with the Golden Gun. I didn't think to do any kind of research prior, and I just assumed the books would be mostly standalone adventures that the films adapted from. Sure, there would be differences, but I thought that by seeing the respective film, I had a primer on the book's story. If you know the Golden Gun novel, you can imagine how quickly that disillusionment fell apart. After that experience, I was quick to readjust my expectations and started again from a more natural place, which was, of course, Casino Royale. At the time, we were 2 years away from the Daniel Craig adaptation, and I had yet to see the 1967 spoof, so I was treated to something that felt wholly original in plot apart from the film series. It was a breezy read at the time due to its simple plot and relatively short page count. You can also imagine how most of the substance went over my head. Fast forward more than 20 years, and it is the one I go back to the most often. I don't think I'd declare it to be my favorite of the Fleming books, but I think it's one of the most well-constructed. There are several themes that can be attached to the book, such as betrayal, mirrors, and the shattering of perceptions, and we'll talk about some of that. Reading the book this time, the major one that stood out to me was control and the lack thereof. All the major players in the book have someone else they answer to. They are agents controlled by higher-ups, and each is expendable. This gives the book surprisingly low stakes in the grand scheme of things. This is just one of a bunch of operations, and has no special distinction about it beyond being led by a 00 agent. Yet it is one of incredible risks, as there's no telling if Bond will even offer much of a battle at the card table to Le Chiffre, and Le Chiffre is already aware of who Bond is, placing surveillance on him and looking for ways to eliminate him before the game. In all honesty, the operation is a foolhardy one and everyone seems to know it. It's centered on a game of chance, but the possible success yields too great a prize to be ignored. As a character, our protagonist James Bond is one that likes to have a certain degree of control of the situation. The first chapter is pretty short and presents a mundane series of sequential events, but it sets up everything we need to know about the man. He is someone who doesn't push himself past his limits, which helps him to be mentally alert and avoid mistakes. This is portrayed by him suddenly deciding to go to bed. He maintains a working knowledge of his cover and world events so he can be present in the moment and know his role in the job. He has placed telltale traps in his hotel room to alert him to any intruders while he is away. And he is a man of habits. He regularly smokes, he records his winnings in a notebook, and he sleeps with a gun under his pillow. As his inner monologue explains, he is used to oblique control and rather likes it, and his attention to detail is what keeps him alive. This paints us a picture of a man who wants to keep his world simple. He further admits to himself that he has yet to be tested by the world. He's never been pushed beyond his comfort zone, where emotion and instinct are the sole but weak governors of your fate. This assignment will have him face near certain death, a breakdown of his convictions and beliefs, and even falling in love hard enough to blind him. It's a rude awakening of a man who believed he knew how the world of spies works. He may be well versed in a practical sense, but he has yet to encounter the true shadows of the world. And emotionally, he's not experienced the free fall so many of us feel when encountering life's pivots. That's why the second half of the book is so crucial to the story. It all happens after the operation has technically ended, so Bond very well could have just left Vesper to her fate with Le Chiffre and returned to England. Instead, he chooses to go after her, and he encounters a brutal torture. In this experience, Le Chiffre brings to light Bond's weak perception of the situation. Bond was playing a child's game, one where the good and bad guys are clearly defined and there's a sense of righteous justice that determines the hero will always win. In other words, a controlled narrative. There's a very real chance in this situation that our hero will die a horrible, painful, and ignoble death, with Le Chiffre running back off into the shadows. At the very climax of the torture, Le Chiffre is killed by an agent of Smersh, which beautifully illustrates this notion. Le Chiffre may be the hero of his own story in his mind, but he is promptly killed on the order of his superiors, putting an end to a chance of Le Chiffre having a happy ending. There is no karmic justice in this universe, just the actions of people trying to control their little worlds. The Smersh agent even specifically claims, "We cannot see the end of the trouble you have caused," referring to Le Chiffre, reminding us that this is about control to them, and that they can't have someone who upsets the stability that control of a situation presents. When Bond recovers, he decides to resign from the service and talks to Mathis about heroes and villains. History is moving pretty quickly these days, and the heroes and villains keep on changing parts. He's no longer sure of himself. Thus, Bond seeks to excuse himself from the complicated job and seek for another opportunity where he might find a clarity of purpose. That is, a relationship with Vesper that may lead to marriage. Traveling down that road could allow him to at least have partial control of his life in something that's more routine but fulfilling. When Vesper is revealed to be a double agent and commits suicide, Bond realizes there are no more options for him but to return to the service. Yet he is reinvigorated as he determines his new purpose will be to hunt the ones behind the enemy lines. The business of espionage could be left to the white-collar boys. They could spy and catch the spies. He would go after the threat behind the spies, the threat that made them spy. This gives us a clear direction for Bond in the future novels. He would go after the hand that holds the gun and the whip, destroying the controlling forces that perpetuate this battle of spies. He is a bullet without a target at the beginning of the story, and Vesper's death has given him one at the end. His world has circled back to where he started. He is still a secret agent. But instead of one who takes assignments with dispassion, he would be one with a purpose and a specific goal. By having the light at the end of the tunnel clearly shown to him, Bond truly becomes an active agent in the war against evil. And the villains for Bond are defined as the ones who instigate evil from the shadows. This ties into other themes like betrayal. Control and betrayal are both centered around purpose. What leads someone to betray their organization and country, and what could prevent them from doing so? For Le Chiffre, it was greed. For Vesper, it was love. Except for Bond, in this story, it is characters who have made their purpose clear who are not prone to betrayal, like Mathis and Leiter. When Mathis leaves Bond in the recovery room, he says, "Surround yourself with human beings, my dear James. They are easier to fight for than principles." Mathis suggests that loved ones may serve a clearer purpose than an idea. At the end of the story, though, Bond is motivated by the death of a loved one to fight for a principle, which will carry him through the rest of the stories. This is an interesting subversion of Mathis's suggestion. But in order for Bond to discover that purpose, he must look in the mirror, and this book provides two fantastic foils for Bond to examine himself: Le Chiffre and Vesper. Throughout the story, Le Chiffre is portrayed as the physical mirror of Bond, a man who enjoys the finer things in life like food and clothes, who does his job with ruthless efficiency untouched by love, who enjoys fast cars, has a large sexual appetite, and who is adept at small arms and personal combat. Le Chiffre is a distinguished agent of a secret society, and while he is respected for his achievements, he is fairly low on the ladder of control. His death, like Bond's, would not cripple his organization. When Le Chiffre threatens Bond's life, he comes to realize how similar they are, and that creates a crisis of conscience that Bond grapples with for the rest of the story. Vesper serves as a mirror for Bond to contemplate his emotions. At the beginning of the book, Bond bemoans the addition of Vesper to the team, revealing a fairly misogynistic view. Bond claims women are for recreation. On a job, they got in the way and fogged things up with sex and hurt feelings and all the emotional baggage they carried around. One had to look out for them and take care of them. When he meets Vesper, he feels an animalistic desire for her, characterized as lustful passion. When he recovers from the torture, that desire to sleep with her is still at the forefront of his interactions with her. What I find most amusing, but also crucial to Bond's character arc, is that in the third act, Bond is hypocritically guilty of all the baggage he claimed women brought to the table. He becomes so enamored with her that he willfully turns a blind eye to her mistakes and ignores or trivializes the warning signs. He tries to reconcile his feelings of love with the changing moods of Vesper that will rotate between liveliness and giving the cold shoulder. In essence, he fogs up the reality of the situation by his emotions. And in the end, Bond is blindsided with reality when he discovers her duplicity. The final line of the book suggests that Bond is shutting himself down to future emotional entanglements by calling her a bitch. the same word he called her earlier in the story at the end of chapter 4. But as we'll discover in the later books, Bond cannot switch himself off so easily in that department. The door to a new world has been opened, and he can't ever shut it completely again. While he battles with Smersh and then later Spectre, Bond will explore deeper relationships time and time again, though the ghost of Vesper will hang over him as a reminder of the cost he might have to pay again for those indulgences. This lack of emotions may have been the thing to keep Bond alive before, but it also left his personal existence cold, hollow, and ultimately just a serviceable one. In order to get the most out of life, your heart must be part of it, and Bond's heart will be continually tested and refined in the coming years. In this very first story, Ian Fleming is taking the time to emotionally define his hero for the coming journey. But you can also see in this meditation on Bond, Fleming's working through his own feelings about having to give up the bachelor life in place of marriage and a family. He's mourning the life he's leaving behind and trying to give himself something to look forward to that'll give him a similar excitement or fulfillment he gleaned from the single years. I think of all the Bond books, this is the one where I see Fleming's heart shine through the most, and that's what gives this book such an attractive quality to me. If I want a great James Bond adventure, I have plenty of avenues to pursue. Other films, books, or video games will scratch that itch just fine. But if I want an engrossing meditation on life with Bond at the center, Casino Royale is one of the few Bond stories I turn to. I do want to be careful, though, in making clear my thoughts on this book. While I have a lot of praise for it, I'm not claiming it's amongst the best literature I've ever read. I'm not even sure I'd give any of Fleming's books that distinction, though I do think these stories have something unique about them. I've once heard Fleming described as airport literature. You know, the books you see on kiosks at the airport that you pick up to give yourself something to do during the flight. I'd also put a lot of Tom Clancy and Robert Ludlum books in this category too, based off of what I've seen there. Yet I think Fleming's works are a bit better than the cheap quality that description suggests. The reason I go to Fleming, though, is not because I'm a big Bond fan. It's because I find Fleming's writing style easier to digest and more enjoyable. Other reviewers have touched on this as well. Fleming isn't consistently eloquent with word choices or complex in his story structures, but his descriptions of Bond's world and thought process and the way his plots unfurl are eminently engaging. They are fast reads, both with their relatively small page count and their ability to keep you invested on the page. I chalk a lot of this to Fleming's work as a journalist and reporter. He has a great sense for what may be interesting or important to his work, and he strives to keep us attached to what we're reading. It can come off as dry ramblings if you're only going into a story for the plot, but if you want stylishly developed worlds that you can clearly picture in your mind, if you want a man you can accompany on a fantasy-fueled take on espionage and high society, then Fleming is your key to that kind of adventure. I get a lot out of returning to Fleming, and it's easy to see what appealed to Cubby and Harry when they started making the films. For certain, the character of Bond must have been intriguing to them, but given how much that character changed throughout the films from that initial literary version, I think a larger part of the attraction was the way Fleming's stories unfolded themselves in the plot and the glamorous world they took place in. It's enticing, and Cubby and Harry were right to bring that world to the silver screen. One of the problems I have with Fleming is that his character building of supporting players is a bit weak. Not always, but often, and particularly with women. For as much weight as Vesper has in the story, she's nowhere near the most interesting of Fleming's heroines. Vesper's honestly a bit bland, and I think this is a consequence of Fleming writing her as distant for most of her scenes. It seems like we barely get a picture of her worldview and personality before we get the troubled Vesper in the third act, where her distance from Bond is a critical part of the story. It may serve the larger themes better, but it does mean she suffers as an individual, and that's a bit sad in hindsight given how she subconsciously figures into the later books. Fleming does have a knack for writing the confrontations with the villains, however. The torture scene in Chapter 17 is one of my favorite scenes from any of these books. You get a great sense of the bleak despair of the situation, how painful it is to bond, and in a few words, Le Chiffre presents the basis for an interesting examination of heroes and villains, which Bond will do with Mathis in the subsequent chapters. I must give equal credit to how Fleming can make a card game captivating. He makes each flip of the cards a decisive point in the progression of the scene, and you can read the subtext of the battle Bond and Le Chiffre are waging against each other. The 2006 film is far more about the men playing off of each other, whereas the book places equal focus on both the physical events of the game and the emotional war. It's quite effective. This story has had 3 distinct film adaptations. The 1954 version omits the third act with Vesper entirely and has none of Bond's character arc, which makes it feel a bit lacking. However, I completely understand cutting this as you only have an hour to tell the story, and the card game and torture are going to be more visually interesting to an audience than Bond's brooding. The 1967 spoof carries over a few of the story elements, such as the card game, the torture scene, and a form of Vesper's betrayal. But it is a spoof and naturally doesn't focus on the emotional heart of the story. It does feature perhaps the most concentration on Baccarat that any of the Bond films have ever done. The 2006 Daniel Craig version understandably adds a lot to the story, setting up Bond's character arc while also depicting how Le Chiffre gets into a financial pickle. And it does make some significant changes to the story, such as changing the game from Chemin de Fer to Texas Hold'em, and having Bond witness Vesper's suicide. However, I would still label it one of the most faithful adaptations of the series. It's not as strictly faithful to the events like On Her Majesty's Secret Service or Dr. No, but it is faithful in that whenever there is a change, it's either to better draw out the characters or it's a modern cinematic update that retains the point of the original in the story, such as how I feel about Jaws or the Lord of the Rings trilogy. For example, I absolutely believe you could have left the central game as Baccarat and just had an exposition-heavy scene like the 1954 adaptation to explain the rules. However, changing it to Texas Hold'em is fine to me, as the point of the game is the same. It's a battle of wits and intuition as much as it is luck. Bond's character arc and its ending largely resembles that from the book. It's about Bond looking at the big picture and being tested by love, and he gains the same purpose from the book to go after the threat behind the spies. However, his misogynistic view of women is downplayed, I suspect in part to appease modern audiences, though it is still somewhat there. My favorite line in the film is Vesper's summation of Bond's attitude towards women. You think of women as disposable pleasures rather than meaningful pursuits, which can be aptly applied to the literary Bond as well. On the whole, I love both the book and the film, but I think the film appeals to me more and is more my cup of tea. It does streamline some of the thematic discussions from the book and has more plot, but I think it retains the important stuff. I think it's better paced. I think the characters are more defined, with Vesper and the romance being vast improvements from the book. And I love the addition of the conflict with M, which adds a new dimension to Bond's arc. Plus, I like the ending a touch more. Casino Royale is an excellent start to the series, and one of the more impressive debuts I've seen. It has a unique status in the public consciousness, not just because it's the first book, but I think partly because it took us so long to get a satisfactory film adaptation, and because it's one of the best dives into the character of the literary Bond. I can understand if the absurdity of the gambling operation is too much for some, or if they're put off by the harsher aspects of this version of Bond compared to the film version. But I kind of want my Bond adventures to be a bit ridiculous, and Fleming's imagination in concocting this scenario is something I greatly admire. And B, I've never had a problem with different versions or takes on Bond coexisting. I have my preference for what I want, but I'm willing to put that to the side and embrace a new version if you can sell me on it with a great experience. And Casino Royale is exactly that to me. A great experience that introduces us to one of the more interesting literary characters of Cold War fiction. Fleming would improve on his writing in future stories, and some of those are quite a bit better to me. But if the first offering is this good, then it's no wonder why so many are compelled to read more of the books afterwards, and I must tip my hat to Fleming for having the foresight to create a literary extension of himself that would pave the way for one of the true phenomenons of cinema.